All right, so let's take a look at some of the producer theory terms that we looked at last week, because these will be a running theme for this lecture as well. Okay. So first, let's start with total revenue. And total revenue is just defined as the price times the quantity. Okay, so sorry. So total revenue equals P times Q. And, this is nothing new. You'd seen this back in the days of elasticity, however many lectures ago. And it's really just the amount of money that a company is raking in before expenses. Okay. Marginal revenue is the revenue from the next additional unit sold. Okay. So if I'm looking at the marginal revenue from Q1 to Q2, that's going to be equal to price Q2 minus price of Q1. Or sorry, price times Q2 plus price times Q1. Okay. And then you can divide it by Q2 minus Q1. Okay, so let's say I sold one extra unit, and the price dropped from. So let's say I sold one extra unit. Old Q1 equals 6, so therefore Q2 is going to equal 7, the next unit, and price dropped from 8 to 7. Okay. So my marginal revenue is equal to change in total revenue. Okay. So P1 Q1 equals 6 times 8. P2 Q2 equals 7 times 7. And so TR1, total revenue 1 minus, should be total revenue 2 minus total revenue 1 is equal to 49, right, this one here, minus this one here, 48, 1. So my marginal revenue equals 1. And when you're doing calculus, there's like a technical definition for how you get marginal revenue from the demand curve. Y'all don't know calculus, presumably, so I'm not going to give it to you. I do reference it later in a slide in the Monopoly one, just so that I can have a nice, clean graph. But I don't expect you all to use it. I don't expect you to know it. I'm not going to teach it. I had a slide in there, and I'm like, this is no way. So don't worry about that. But there's like a more technical definition of marginal revenue, which is the revenue going from like the unit 1 to unit 1.000001, and it involves calculus. So don't worry about that, but that is the technical definition. That's a limitation for Econ 1, is that there's a lot of stuff that actually is calculus that I can't teach in the calculus fashion. That's why elasticity is not as clear as I think it could be. And there's different things with like the marginal utility that could be a little bit better. Calculus it's nice to know calculus. Maybe one day RCBC will have a Econ 2 that involves calc, but until that day. All right. There are 3 types of profit that I brought up. So there's economic profit versus accounting profit. So economic profit is your total revenue minus your economic cost. Okay. Econ profit equals total revenue minus econ costs. And remember, econ costs and this goes back to like lecture 2 or something like that, 2 or 3, is your, I think it's 2, op cost plus explicit cost. Okay, so when you're starting a business, and you're determining, do I start a business in baking cakes, or do I start a business in baking bread? Okay, well, just because you post profit, like accounting profit, just because you post, you make more money than you spend in costs, doesn't mean that you made the right decision. Okay, and that's what economists want to factor in. Did you make the right decision? So if you make decision 1, well, you need to consider, would decision 2 have been better, and that's your opportunity cost, right? The cost of not becoming a baker because instead or cost of not baking cakes because instead you bake bread. Okay. So distinguish that with accounting profit, which is just accounting profit, which is just TR minus your explicit costs. Okay. And then normal profit, we said last week, is when your econ profit equals 0 versus econ profit, which is assumed to be greater than 0. So if I say you're making economic profit, I'm saying you're making economic profit greater than 0. If I'm saying you're making normal profit, basically you might be making accounting profit, but you're indifferent between this industry and another industry. Your opportunity cost justifies indifference between baking bread and baking cakes. Okay, so normal profit is basically the competitive profit, and if your econ profit is less than 0, basically, or if your econ profit is less than 0 and your accounting profit is greater than 0, you're posting positive, you're making positive money, you're able to pay your workers and everything, but you'd be able to make more money in a different industry. Okay, if your normal profit is greater than 0, aka if you have economic profit, what that tells me is that there should be more firms in your industry. Your industry is an attractive industry, something that other people aren't factoring in the opportunity cost of. So there's basically an opportunity cost of going into a different industry that, like, people who go in that industry are not considering your own industry. Okay, so if there's positive economic profit for being a baker, you'd expect that in the short run, people would want to enter into and become bakers, so that eventually the economic profit goes to 0, normal profit. Okay. Yeah, that is the textbook. And that's not the one either. Where did it go? Where'd you go? I miss you so. All right. We had a production function, which is just a way of mapping your inputs to your outputs. So I gave you an actual function, y equals some function of k and L, capital and labor, and from there you could track how much of the thing you're making you actually make. So if you're a baker, your inputs could be your capital, which is the dough, and your labor is how many hours you work. So if I work 2 hours with 13 bags of dough, I produce 30 loaves of bread. That is a point on the production function. Okay, and depending on how you change your inputs, you're going to get different outputs. That's why it's a function. Typically, we assume that the production function has this here diminishing marginal product. And what do I mean by that? So usually a production function. Okay. So this is your input. Okay. This is your output. Typically, I assume that your production function is going to look like this, where, if you work 80 hours, you're probably going to make more bread, but the 79th hour to the 80th hour, you're probably going to make very little bread, and the 0 to the first hour, you're probably going to make a lot of bread. Okay, I come across diminishing marginal product for every hour that I spend in this course. I just spent a lot of time probably on things that aren't increasing your total knowledge by anything but marginal marginal amounts. Of course, I think that in the long run, because I teach this course a lot, it'll be beneficial. But for now, it's probably could have spent my time grading or something like that. But that's like another thing, like grading, right? Grading probably has diminishing marginal product. If I looked at your paper, I saw like, hey, this looks like it's completely off. They're probably like a C or D. And I saw, okay, look, they seem to get the major points B. I probably be pretty close with a 5-minute grade. Instead, I spend 30 minutes per paper like a dope because I want to make sure that your grades are correct. And then at the end of the day, I'm really tired and I might input them falsely. That's why I want you guys to double check your grades. But anyway, no, I'm being facetious. Still double check your grades because I am human and I make errors like anybody else. But I put a lot of time into your grading because people want to know what their grades are. They want their grades to be accurate, and I believe that grades should be accurate. So I want to be able to justify everything. But I'm probably, by putting in that extra hour, moving from here to here and not from here to here, where if I just eyeball your grades, I'd probably be pretty damn close to what you're actually getting. Okay, so that's diminishing marginal product. The more hours you put into it, the less productive you are in that particular hour. Okay. So then we talked about a bunch of different kinds of costs. We had total costs, we had fixed costs, variable cost, average total cost, average variable cost, and average fixed cost, which I guess I didn't think was important enough to include because it kind of isn't. So let's do this relationship. So total cost, we typically think of as another function. So TC of Q, okay? And that's usually something that, is just firm specific, something that we assume, like the firm has, for the first unit, $100 of cost, and for the second unit, it's $80 of cost. For the third unit, it's $125 of cost. So some random numbers, depending on probably what the actual industry looks like, if you're doing a legitimate study and not just throw numbers at the wall like, we do in Econ 1 because, we're doing toy examples and we're not actually looking at real industries. Okay. So total cost is going to be some function, and then we can break that down into variable cost and your fixed cost. Okay. And your fixed cost is essentially the kind of like a longer run cost, and basically it's the things that you put in before you even sell anything. So if you're, producing music, right, your fixed cost will be the time it takes so fixed cost in making music, okay? Labor hours in order to make a song, okay? Guitars, or I guess instruments, okay? Time spent finding a band. Okay, your variable cost could be, for nowadays music is probably very low variable cost. But let's say this is 10 years ago. Cost of pressing an album or a CD or vinyl. Probably like some sort of copyright cost associated with maintaining the amount of selling. Probably song. Let's just stick with cost of pressing an album for now, because songs is like a low variable cost industry. Let's do a different one because that is probably a bad example. Fixed cost in, let's say, producing producing a vaccine. Okay, so your R&D is going to be a fixed cost. Okay, you have to like pay your researchers a certain amount of time to come up with the vaccine, right? Variable cost will be your syringes to deliver the vaccine, like cotton swabs, Band-Aids, and that kind of stuff. The ingredients for the vaccine, right? Maybe you need a certain number of cells. I don't know the first thing about science, but that kind of thing. That the different things that if you're selling per quantity, has to go into it. So let's do one more. So let's say fixed cost for a rental car business. So you're going to have to buy property in order to have your fleet there. Buy a fleet of cars. Presumably it's fixed in the long term, but as the time horizon expands, it might be more malleable. So over 10 years, is that really fixed cost? Probably not, because you're probably swapping out your cars every couple of years. But in a year, it's probably a fixed cost, yeah. Variable costs would be gas, upkeep, labor. So the more, let's say you expect Christmas is going to be a busy time for rental cars. You're going to want to staff more. You're going to want to have more people there to maintain your cars. You're probably going to have to replace gas, even though you probably upcharge gas so that the consumer ends up paying the cost anyway. But those would be examples of variable costs. So variable costs are not fixed at all. They're things that vary by quantity versus fixed cost, which don't vary by quantity. Those are things that you typically pay up front. And the definition of fixed versus variable costs might depend on what's your time frame. So for a month, your rent is a fixed cost. If you're renting out a rental, like a property. Over a year, is that same rent fixed cost? Maybe, but over 2 years, probably not, because you could, swap it out. Maybe decrease your fixed cost over the long run. Maybe not rent at all. So that in the end of the producer theory lecture, we had the short run average total cost and the long run average total cost. Graph looks something like this. That should be touching. Where, depending on the time frame, you could swap out your fixed cost to minimize your long run average total cost. Okay. So each one of these short runs depends on a particular amount of fixed cost, but in the long run, you can actually minimize the fixed cost so that you get the minimum of the short run to average total cost curves, and that forms your long run average total cost curve. If you're confused about that, go back to that particular lecture. It's one of the last slides on that. But in the long run, your average total cost is going to be the minimum of all your short run average total costs, because fixed cost is now a variable that you can manipulate. That's all I'm really saying. And then your average total cost is just going to be your total cost divided by your quantity. Okay. So we said that total cost of Q is equal to V. Total cost of Q is equal to your variable. Geez, Louise. Is equal. I cannot type today, guys. BCQ plus FC. So your ATCQ is going to be your total cost Q divided by quantity, okay? Which is going to be your BCQ divided by quantity plus your FC divided by quantity. So notice that fixed cost is not going to depend on quantity, okay? And then we can say VCQ divided by quantity. Well, what is that? That's just your average variable cost plus your average fixed cost. Okay. So average fixed cost does vary by quantity because you've now introduced that into the equation. I'll show you that once I expand the width of this. Okay. So by virtue of adding this Q here, this term for average fixed cost now is a function of Q. Okay. All right. So let's say we're looking at the short run again. Okay. So there's your quantity. The y-axis is just basically dollars. It could be cost or it could be revenue. I guess in this case we're just talking about cost, so let's just say cost. Okay. Your fixed cost is going to be a straight line. Okay. Because it doesn't vary by quantity, right? Your variable costs are going to increase in quantity. Okay. So the more things you make, the higher your variable cost. And then, and your total cost is going to be this here plus this, right? So it's going to be, if this is like 100 and this is like 10, this will be 110 right here. Okay. Your average total cost is going to start really high because it's going to be like your average fixed cost is basically going to be like this, right? Because the more you produce, you're just dividing by quantity. So if the fixed cost is 100, your quantity goes from 9 to 10. Well, you're dividing 100 by 9, and then you're dividing 100 by 10. Okay, so the average fixed cost is going to be decreasing. Variable cost depends on the function. Let's say variable costs are stagnant like this, just for the sake of it. So your average total cost is going to be decreasing, right? Sorry, this is the average variable cost, I should say. So your average total cost will be this plus this divided by quantity. I don't know why I made average fixed cost so high. So this plus this is going to equal your average variable cost. And in the long run, as average fixed cost goes to 0, your this is average total cost, G's, ATC. So this is A, V, C, this is A, T, C. Average fixed cost should drop pretty fast, actually. So your average total cost will start to look like this. Okay. So as quantity goes to infinity, average fixed cost goes to 0, which means that average total cost goes to average variable cost, right? If we're looking at the function here, fixed cost, which is like 100 or some constant number, divided by q, which is going to infinity, will be 0. Something divided by infinity is 0, unless it's infinity itself. So then this term goes to 0, which means that average total cost equals average variable cost as q goes to infinity. All right. Okay, the last point is marginal cost, which y'all are very familiar with at this point. Marginal cost is going to be the change in total cost, okay, going from one unit to the next. Typically, marginal cost will start really high and go like this. Okay. And marginal cost even though I didn't draw it this way, tends to cross the axis at the point that minimizes average total cost. I got a better slide in this last week, but basically, so both of these should, because average variable cost is like this. Sorry. These should actually curve up a little bit. But the example I gave was your marginal cost is like your next grade, right? And your average is the average of your grades. So if your average was an 80 and you got an 86, that drives your average up, right? On your next exam, right? So your marginal cost is going to be driving the average total cost. So if marginal cost is decreasing, right, that's going to drive your average total cost down. Like if your marginal cost is below your average, right, it's going to drive it down. If your marginal cost is above your average, it's going to drive your average total cost up. And at the point where marginal cost stops decreasing, stops being below average total cost, so this is your marginal cost. Okay. So your marginal cost here then sees below ATC, drives it down. Okay. At this point, your marginal cost is driving it up. Okay. So that's, like I said, if you're consistently getting tests that are below your average, well, your average is going to drop. If you're consistently getting tests that are above your average, well, your average is going to increase. So at the point where your marginal cost crosses your average total cost, well, then it stops driving your average total cost down and starts driving it up. So this must be your minimum average total cost. Okay, like if you're doing really poorly in the class and your average is an 80 and you're getting 70s, well, it's going to drive it down. But let's say you pick your grade up and your average is now like at a 75. Well, the second you get a 76, well, that's driving your average up. Okay, so the 75 is going to be the minimum grade that you get as long as you stay above 75 going forward. So as long as you're above the average, you're driving the average up. So that's why the cross point between the ATC and the marginal cost is your lowest point for average total cost. Okay, I already said this, but Variable costs can change in the short run. Fixed costs cannot. And I already said this one, the long run average total cost curve is the envelope. So by the envelope, I mean what I just drew up here. Oh, JK. Oh, no. What I just drew up. Where is it? Up here, the envelope, like, I don't know why it's called an envelope, but this is an envelope. The minimums of all your short run average total cost. Okay. And then the last point we talked about, which I guess I didn't really stress on enough, but is returns to scale. And basically your returns to scale is how your costs change over time. So basically, if you have costs that increase as you produce more, we call that decreasing returns to scale. And what that means is you kind of want to keep your industry basically lean. You don't want to produce too much. If your costs decrease as you produce more, well, you really want to produce as much as possible. If your costs are constant, it doesn't really matter. So think about like let's say you're in an increasing returns to scale environment. Basically, what does that mean? It means that imagine that there's a firm there that's already in that industry. So an example of an increasing returns to scale usually is a high fixed cost. You can think of that like utilities, like Comcast, for instance, or natural gas or something like that. High fixed cost. So it's really hard to enter that market. But once you do, once you've got the fixed cost down, the variable cost is very low, right? So it's very easy for you to, like, once you paid the fixed cost, it doesn't matter if you produce for one person or you produce for 1,000 people. Your costs are pretty much the same. So you want to produce to as many people as possible. Okay. So once Comcast is in the market, it's really hard for another person to get in there because Comcast has already kind of tapped the whole market share. Okay. For you to enter, you're basically paying a high fixed cost. You're not even sure if the market can sustain two firms there. A low fixed cost industry, on the other hand, very easy to enter. So these would have decreasing returns to scale. So the more you produce, the higher your cost. So you're going to want to keep production low. So other firms will probably pop up and produce as well. So you probably have a lot of firms that are producing very little, and that's more like your kind of perfect competition, whereas increasing returns to scale looks more like monopoly or monopolistic competition. Okay, or maybe not monopolistic competition, monopoly, oligopoly. Okay, I think that's it. Okay.